Good evening and welcome. I'm Rob King and welcome to the One Gallon Brewing channel. The purpose of this channel is to share my experiences as a new home brewer, to go through various different types of recipes and just learn lessons along the way, and in a very practical sense share the problem solving that goes along with most brewing experiences. And this is where my actual work life and my hobby, which is home brewing, come together, because actually using data for data analysis and solving problems is a big part of my day job. And I'm applying a lot of those principles and theories to the activity of home brewing. And that is definitely true today as we sort of talk about the lessons learned from a couple of brews that I've done and the problem diagnosis methodology I went through to solve them, and a few lessons learned myself in things I could have done better. So, our agenda for today. First of all, I'm going to talk a little bit about why 1 gallon brewing is so important, and then we're going to jump into the 9 issues that I faced and the responses to those issues. I'm also going to look at a couple of red herrings that I ran into along the way that I thought could have been a cause of the problem, but actually were really not. We've got a few key takeaways, and I'm then going to talk about some of the other things going on the channel during the month of September, and also plans for the next live stream. One gallon brewing then. And why is it 1 gallon brewing is so interesting to me? So it's a very good starting point for a new home brewer, as I was. Now on the channel, I'm sharing homebrew number 5, which is the Silversmith's session ale. And but in practice, behind the scenes, I have literally just started brew number 13. So there's lots going on, and actually, it's a fun and innovative batch size. It means I can do lots of these different things, lots of different recipes, and learn lots from them. And the space and equipment needs are small. That having been said, the opportunities to think big and be able to sort of use some of the other pieces of equipment is growing and growing and growing. And again, sharing how that grows one piece at a time. In fact, the last live stream I did just talked about my equipment obsession, and I'm a tech guy and I love tech, and therefore some of these things that come along, you just go, yes, I really need one of those. The good news is, of course, the big brews scale down to a small 1 gallon size, and actually all the fundamentals are the same at a lower volume. So this means that all of the things we're learning as we go through these different recipes can simply be applied at a larger scale once you're ready to sort of jump into that bigger yard of activity. So without further ado, let's have a look at some of that problem solving and troubleshooting. And as I mentioned, the first thing was that I actually ran into some of these problems myself, I actually ran into some of these problems myself on 2 of the brews that I did. The first was actually a turbo cider, which is a series that's already gone up and is on the channel. And the second was a more recent one with a mild and some of the problems I encountered there. But also actually the Goldsmith's sort of honey ale, which again was the second brew I think I did. There were a few lessons learned in that are equally applicable to the whole approach to troubleshooting and diagnosis. So the very first problem I encountered was a turbo cider that appeared not to be doing anything at all. And so there is a sort of sequence of thought patterns to go through, and the first thought pattern to apply is the yeast alive? There are lots of reasons that the yeast could be dead, but the first one is, actually, if the yeast is not alive, it is quite reasonable to just simply pitch an additional yeast. And there are actually some revival type yeast or bottle carbonation yeasts that are out there that are specifically designed to try and restart a stuck fermentation. So the very first thing to think about, if nothing is happening at all, is simply to ask yourself the question, is the yeast alive? And the response to that is to add some further yeast into your must or into your sort of wort, depending on what you're brewing. Now, before I would have jumped to that sort of extreme estate, there are a couple of other diagnosis steps I would have gone through, and in practice, actually, in the video that I did for the turbo cider take 2, what happened was these are actually the sequence of events that I did go through to sort of see if I could revive the problem. Now, I will explain what the real problem was sort of later on, but actually there was a sort of systematic thinking to looking at that problem. And the first part of that systematic thinking was oxygen. That when you sort of first prepare your wort, the one thing you want to do is give your yeast some encouragement, and that encouragement is oxygen. So we sort of filter it through a funnel, we shake it up, we do lots of things to simply make sure there's plenty of oxygen in the mix. If you've got a more extreme setup, I've even heard of people sort of bubbling oxygen through their liquor. That's pretty impressive stuff. Now, that was actually my very first go-to, was to give it a good shake and then try and introduce a little bit more oxygen into the must and see if that would actually help encourage it to start. Literally at the same time as I did that, I also did item number 3, which was yeast nutrient. And yeast, needs a number of different nutrients that, depending on the brew that you're doing, may not be present. The most obvious sort of first nutrient to add is nitrogen. One of the things that the yeast needs, and DAP, which is a type of yeast nutrient, will actually sort of add more nitrogen and actually sort of help revive your brew potentially. But there are other yeast nutrients that may be absent depending on the type of brew you're doing. I've brewed a seltzer recently, which is basically alcoholic water. So by itself, without any nutrients, there was nothing for the yeast to use, and you have to make sure that you add appropriate levels of nutrient for the yeast to be able to thrive and grow that wouldn't be present, sort of in water alone. Whereas obviously in a typical beer, there are lots of nutrients already there, and sort of you are less likely to need to add yeast nutrient in to try and encourage it along. So I think oxygen, yeast nutrient, see if you can revive the yeast that's there. The other thing that you can do without even sort of pitching in additional yeast is to consider the temperature. Now, I am very conscious of this because some yeasts are very specific in terms of their operating temperature, and now I always do look at the back of the yeast packet to sort of see what the operating temperature is, or the optimum operating temperature is, so I can try and actually sort of fall comfortably within the middle of that range. And again, with my turbo cider, when I was having a problem, one of the things I did do was move it to a warmer location. Now, this was based purely on the assumption that it needed a bit more heat, but that could have actually been wrong, and the temperature could have been too high, and I would have needed to move it to a cooler location. So again, just be very conscious of the yeast that you're using, be conscious of the optimum operating temperature for that yeast, and again, if you're falling outside of that range, it doesn't mean that the fermentation won't start or the fermentation won't happen. It's just likely to get slower and slower and slower the more that you fall outside of the range. So I think sort of in terms of sort of before you consider pitching some additional yeast, these are probably the first few steps you would go through. Now I made an even bigger mistake, which brings us to numbers 5 and number 6 on my list. So there were no bubbles in the bubbler, and that was really the only piece of data at the time that I was looking at. I'm now very conscious there are lots of other points of data you can use, even if the bubbles aren't coming through the bubbler, because actually, as I do believe now, with the benefit of hindsight, I did have a leak. Now that was bad news, because it potentially meant that the leak sort of could have let oxygen in. I don't think it's very likely, actually, because it was fairly small, but actually there was a leak right next to where the sort of valve for the airlock was, and I would not be surprised if it just simply went through the path of least resistance, and rather than the airlock. So actually, sort of no bubbles in the bubbler isn't the only data point you should use. There are several other data points to consider, but the first thing to consider is look for leaks, as was the situation sort of in my scenario. What I didn't do, though, and now was the sort of the most heinous of the crimes, is I simply didn't use my eyes. If I'd have used my eyes, this all happened over a period of a few days, roughly 5 or 6 days, and during that time, I think there was a very sort of rapid and successful fermentation that I just wasn't there to see. But if I'd have looked more carefully, it would have been really obvious there was dried krausen around sort of the top of the demijohn, and that would have been the first data that it was telling me fermentation was happening, even though I was seeing no bubbles coming through the bubbler. So your eyes are your best data collection method, and there are lots of data points to look at. So krausen is the first one. It's not, you're not just limited to sort of the bubbles going through the bubbler. The other data item that's really important is the hydrometer. So if you haven't got a hydrometer, this is a really worthwhile, one of the very first pieces of equipment to pick up. And the hydrometer will actually tell you if anything is going on, even if you're not seeing anything happen in the bubbler. And effectively that hydrometer will sort of show you what's going on. And I think, with my turbo cider problem specifically, it really had fermented down quite low, and the hydrometer told me that there was nothing to worry about, and I should have done a hydrometer reading much earlier than I did, because it would have given me more data to work with. Interestingly, back to use your eyes, dummy. There was another thing that was obvious only in hindsight, and that was the yeast cake was forming on the bottom of the demijohn. So again, this wasn't just sort of the yeast landing on the bottom and sitting there. This was obviously the sort of sediment that was coming from the fermentation process. And again, use your eyes, dummy, was definitely something I didn't do, and was the best data collection tool at my disposal. Moving on to a different brew, though. I also brewed recently a mild, and I'd sort of left it alone for a little while, and when I went back, partway through fermentation, I had that sudden stark worry. Oh my gosh, is that mold? Is it infected? Now, what I was seeing was not clearly yes or no. That was definitely mold. It was white bits in the brew, and it could have equally been sediment. And I think, so talking to several people at the time, what I did was I racked it, and this was now going back a little while, and it the brew has turned out fine. So those white pieces, if they were mold, I managed to sort of free the rest of the brew from it. I don't think it was mold. I think it was just sediment. And so the first bit of news really that people started sort of talking to me about was, don't panic, don't panic. It probably isn't. Just progress and sort of work through systematically on the basis that everything's okay. Don't simply try and bin it. Now, that having been said, if you've got blue furry bits climbing up the side, clearly that is mold, and that probably should go straight in the bin. But there's lots of degrees of, is it, isn't it, the fall below that, and so I think if there's a chance that it's not mold, don't panic, continue. And that, thankfully was exactly what I had. I also had another problem with my mild, and that was there was a really strong solvent smell when I sort of looked at it as well. So armed with the white bits and this solvent smell, I was like, oh dear, oh dear, this is terrible. And there are lots and lots of potential bad smells that early in the fermentation will simply sort of move on and mellow and disappear and actually work out through the beer, which actually, again, once again, is my experience on this one. Now, what I did find was one of the causes of is a more solvent smell was actually mashing at too high a temperature, and my temperature control, I have to say, in those early brews, well, probably in my later brews too, has been a bit challenging, and so I do believe that it's very likely that the mistake I made during the mash was causing this off smell during fermentation that actually didn't linger, didn't stay with the beer all the way through to the very end. So I think one of the things that we can take away from odours in particular is the fact that however bad it smells, within reason, once again, however bad it smells, it is likely that it's all fine, especially when you are so early in the fermentation process. And even that applies to taste. So going back to the Goldsmith's Honey Ale, my second only brew, and in the series with that, I actually did a taste test at the end, and my heartfelt disappointment that it didn't quite turn out how I expected come through in the video. Now, I had 2 bottles, which I never got to at the time, never got back to. And only relatively recently, 120 days after the original brew, I did decide to crack open one of those Goldsmith's Honey Ales, and oh my goodness, it was a different beer. It was absolutely spot on. And so again, I think one of the lessons I'm learning is and I'm finding very hard to figure out the answer to this question due to my lack of knowledge in terms of the number of brews that I've done, is sort of how long some of these ales take to mature, and therefore when they will come good, if they and so with my Goldsmith's Honey Ale, I have 1 bottle left that I am very much looking forward to drinking, rather than where I was almost ready to dump them because of my disappointment. So it's not always bad news, and I'll come back to that in our takeaways. But before I do that, I'm going to sort of jump into perhaps a few of the red herrings that I sort of wondered whether were causing me problems. And the first one, because I was doing cider, I decided to use the 5 litre plastic bottles, water bottles, to do the fermentation, and it did cross my mind that maybe there was something to do with plastic bottles that was causing me all the problems, and that's why it wasn't fermenting. Ha! No, nada. Those plastic bottles are absolutely fine. The second thing that that I wondered about was I also had quite a lot of headspace, um, and um, and remembering that this is during the fermentation process, that headspace is going to very quickly fill up with CO2, so it's not something to worry about. Now it's more of a problem if you're sort of opening and closing, and having a look every 5 minutes, because that CO2 is going to dissipate. But if you sort of leave it all sort of sealed up with the airlock on, that CO2 will provide you with a layer of protection against oxygen. Now this of course isn't necessarily true later on. So if you decide to rack your beer and primary fermentation has completed and you've got a lot of headspace, now that may be a problem. And there are multiple solutions to that. One is, if you've got some CO2, you can just give it a blast of CO2 and create a fake CO2 layer, which is nice and easy if you've got that option available. I've seen glass marbles being placed in the demijohn to bring the level up, to be able to sort of make sure there's very little headspace, which is great if you've got some glass marbles that would be suitable. And other suggestions is, depending on the type of brew that you're doing, is whether or not you can sort of top it up with another of your brews, therefore creating less headspace, or similar brews. So if you're doing cider, for example, and you've got some other cider that you can use to sort of top it up. So there are a few red herrings I ran into while I was going, and that's certainly were worries that I should not have worried about at the time. But when you're still learning, you do wonder if these things are going to sort of cause you a problem. So from this, I think I have 2 big takeaways. One is the best diagnosis tool at your disposal is your eyesight. And unlike me, in my first experience, I should have used my eyes much more proactively to look and see what was going on. The second, I think, which is was some good advice I was given, and things did fortunately turn out for the best, which is don't panic and don't act rashly in terms of the sort of steps you take. Work systematically and carefully, step by step. And that's true of absolutely any piece of problem solving as we go through the process. So I hope that's been a useful walkthrough of the problem solving, the sort of method and thinking, if you like, that I went through when I encountered these problems. And thank you to sort of the multiple people who sort of I've met on various forums who have also provided that advice. So what about the channel for the month of September? So there's a couple of things I do. I tend to run these live streams roughly every 3 weeks, but every week I put out 2 episodes of the latest brew, and in the month of September that actually is going to be the Turbo Cider version 2.0, and also the DME Real Ale. Both of those series will run throughout the month of September, and you can sort of see there on the screen the series tend to be broken down into an introduction, a brew day, a fermentation stage, a racking stage, and then finally a bottling and drinking and evaluation stage, and so there's roughly an episode that covers each one of those. For simpler brews, I just join them together. For more complex brews where things go a bit wrong, some of that problem diagnosis sort of gets in there. But the thing about all of these episodes are things do go wrong naturally, and what I try to do is just roll with it, have good fun, have a bit of a laugh, but also try and work through to the right answer. And the perfect example of this is a spiced apple wine, which is one of the ones that are coming up soon, which I'm just sort of editing out now, and I followed a recipe perfectly, and the small differences in ingredients that I had to sort of use meant a massive difference in the end result. But there were then additional steps that I could take that actually did bring it all the way back to the same end position as that original recipe. And it's that type of problem solving that you encounter as you go through these activities that's quite fun and quite interesting to see how that works. And of course, you know, there's a few things like my mashing too high problem and stuff like that are just, you know, sort of mistakes that I will learn as we go through, and how, you know, if possible, we can also counter some of those types of mistakes. So each week 2 episodes go up. The Silversmith's Session Ale is running currently to the end of August, and then Turbo Cider sort of version 2 sort of kicks in at the very end of August. 23rd of August will be the first part of that, and then that will run through September, followed by a DME, which is a dry malt extract real ale. So rather than an all grain brew, which were all of my beers to this point, this one was a dry malt extract brew, and we'll sort of see how we got on with that one. The other thing is the next live stream. As I mentioned, I do these live streams roughly every 3 weeks, and so the next one is going to sort of tie in with that Turbo Cider version 2.0. So I've done 3 previous Turbo Ciders and learned sort of multiple lessons from those Turbo Ciders, which led me to do Turbo Cider version 2.0 recipe. So this is the 2.0 recipe. It did work out brilliantly, and so I'm going to share more information alongside that next time. If you haven't seen already, please do take a moment to sort of have a look at the website. Effectively, each brew is broken down into its own playlist. So effectively, I have a playlist for. Go to home. I have a playlist for each of the different home brews. So the very first one was Punk IPA, and if we look at the full playlist, you can sort of see all of the various episodes from siphoning and bottling and the taste test sort of there. And the same is then true of each of the other brews I've done. So the aforementioned Goldsmith's Honey Ale, our Turbo Cider, and, you know, our Turbo Cider Take 2, which is the one where things go wrong. So, you know, do take a look at that one, and we can sort of have a look at all of the things that went wrong and the diagnosis and problem solving that went alongside all of that. Also on the website, also on the YouTube channel, there is also a link to my Medium publication, and once a week I'll try and put up an article about sort of home brewing. Again, you know, this is my in my professional life I write quite a lot, so it's nice to be able to sort of apply that to the world of home brewing, which is what I'm doing. So please take a look, you know, clap, follow, subscribe, and all that malarkey if you can. That is it for me for today. It's definitely a shorter one this time. I hope you've enjoyed that. You know, if you've got any sort of comments or questions, please, you know, comment on this video. Otherwise, I really do appreciate you tuning in and watching. So thank you very much for that. And have a wonderful rest of the evening. And I'll see you again for the next live stream in 3 weeks' time. Thank you and take care.